Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Book 1 of the Ranger's Apprentice, the Early Years series, the tournament at Gorlan. Today we're getting into Chapter 17. Let's go ahead and get into it. In later years, Halt would look back on the days spent traveling with his new friends as a particularly happy time of his life. Up until this point, he had been a solitary person, suspicious of strangers, and, as a result of the events that had led him to leave Hibernia, even his own family. But now, as they crisscrossed the country in search of other rangers to join their band, he found himself in the company of men whose friendship and camaraderie he valued. They were all driven by a common purpose, and they were all men to be admired for their mastery of the ranger's craft. They shared the same skills, of course, and all of them were expert in each one. But some were more skilled than the others at certain disciplines. Crowley, for example, was an absolute adept in the art of moving silently and without being seen. Leander's ability to track and read and understand signs on the forest floor was far above that of his companions. Berrigan's accuracy with both his knives, the big, heavy sacks, and the lighter, smaller throwing knife, was uncanny. Halt found himself asking the others for advice and tips on how to improve his skill in these areas, and he found his companions always willing to share their knowledge with him. As a result, his ability improved with each passing day. As he told himself, he was learning from the best. Halt himself was by far the finest archer in the group. His speed and accuracy were unmatched by any of the others, and since they had left Sadler's farm, he had practiced the extra skill Bob had mentioned, shooting while Abelard was moving at a full gallop, every day when they stopped to camp. Before long, he was almost reproducing the accuracy he showed when shooting from a standing position. The others were fascinated by this technique, and they tried to copy it, with mixed results. Crowley was the most successful, but even he couldn't match Halt. Of course, the redhead didn't admit this, and that it was due to any inferiority on his part. Abelard's obviously got such a smooth gait that it's easy for you to gauge his motions and adjust your shooting to it. He moves like silk, he said to Halt, as they discussed it one evening. Poor old Cropper, he indicated his horse, is such a tanglefoot, it's a wonder he manages to stay upright when he's galloping. Halt regarded Crowley's horse, who was watching them with an interested expression. He hadn't noticed any tendency for him to stumble or lurch unexpectedly when he was galloping. On the other hand, he had noticed a tendency for Crowley to try to rush his release when shooting from horseback. He didn't do it all the time. 3 out of 5 times his shots would fly true, which was a more than acceptable average. But Halt managed to do it 5 out of 5 times. And 10 out of 10 times. He decided, however, to allow his friend this little conceit. They were approaching Seacliff fief, a small barony, set on an island off the southeast coast. The island and the castle built on it was accessed by a flat-bottomed punt that spanned the narrow waterway, separating it from the mainland. Crowley, who was in the lead, raised a hand to stop the others as they approached the little strip of sand where the ferry was beached. They were still inside the fringe of trees, and, so far, they hadn't been noticed by anyone at the ferry station. "Question is," he said, in a low voice, as they formed a semicircle around him, "do we all go across, or just one of us?" He paused, then added, in explanation, were becoming quite a noticeable group, after all. Berrigan shrugged. So people notice us. What harm does that do? People notice, people talk, Halt said. Word could get back to Morgarath that there's a group of renegade rangers recruiting their former comrades. If that happens, he'll start to wonder what we're up to. He'll do that sooner or later anyway, Berrigan pointed out, but Leander joined in, agreeing with Halt. The later, the better. The more we can surprise him, the easier our task is going to be. You think it's going to be easy? Berrigan asked, his eyebrows raised in amusement. I didn't say easy, I said easier, Leander replied doggedly. Berrigan nodded agreement. Fair enough. It's a good point, I suppose. So who gets to ride aboard the ferry? There was a pause. Then Halt said, in a voice that brooked no argument, Crowley. This whole business has been driven by him. He's the one to do it. Seeing there was no disagreement from the others, Crowley prepared to ride out onto the sand. Set up a camp back in the trees, he said. I'll find you when I've made contact with Egon. Egon was the Seacliff ranger, who had been listed on the list of those to be dismissed. Don't get seasick, Berrigan admonished. Crowley regarded the narrow neck of water that separated Seacliff Island from the mainland. The surface was as still as a mill pond. I'll do my best, he said. He urged Cropper forward and rode out into the sunlight. They had all decided to do away with their camouflaged cloaks for the time being. The distinctive pattern marked them out as rangers, or, to be accurate, former rangers. They all wore long cowled cloaks in dull colors of brown or gray or green. But even without the camouflaged pattern, a band of 4 cloaked men, carrying longbows and armed with saxes and throwing knives, would be easy to recognize as rangers of the old school, whereas one man, in a brown cloak, might well be taken for a forester or gamekeeper. Cropper's hoofs made virtually no sound in the fine, dry sand of the beach, aside from a light squeaking as the tiny grains were compressed and rubbed against one another. Crowley was nearly up to the ferry master's small house built on pilings above the high tide mark before he was noticed. "Da! Traveler coming!" It was a young voice, and Crowley saw that there was a boy of about 10 or 12, watching him from behind the railing of the small veranda that spanned 2 sides of the house. A deeper voice answered from inside, the words muffled and indecipherable. Then a door onto the veranda creaked open, and a short but powerfully built man emerged into the light. "Welcome, traveler," the ferrymaster called. He stepped heavily down the 4 stairs that led up to the veranda, buckling on a thick leather belt as he came. Crowley could see a long-bladed dagger in a scabbard on the right-hand side, and as the man reached the first step, he casually took up a blackwood quarterstaff that was leaning against the railing. As welcoming as the ferrymaster might seem, Crowley was still a stranger, and, in these times, no stranger was accepted without some precaution. "I'm looking to cross to the island," Crowley said. The ferrymaster regarded him for a few seconds, taking in the longbow and the shaggy-coated small horse. He said nothing, but Crowley sensed he had been recognized for what he was. Then the man glanced at the flat-bottomed punts pulled up on the beach and the island beyond. "Then I'd say you're in the right place to do it," he said pleasantly. He gestured to Crowley to move toward the punt. "Wait while I get the boat in the water, then you can come aboard." Crowley swung down from the saddle, and led Cropper toward the water's edge. "I'll give you a hand moving her," he offered. But the ferrymaster shook his head. "I can manage," he said. Crowley took in the thick, heavily muscled arms and massive shoulders. He had no doubt the man could move the ferry by himself. The ferrymaster leaned his shoulder against a padded post at one corner of the clumsy vessel and heaved. The punt slid easily down the sand and into the water. Flat-bottomed and wide-beamed as she was, she floated easily in a few inches. Crowley dismounted and led Cropper aboard as the ferrymaster lowered the ramp. "That'll be 1 royal for the 2 of you," the ferrymaster said. Crowley paid, and the man began to haul on the thick rope that drew the flat-bottomed craft across to the far beach. After a few minutes, they glided into the shallows, and the tapered bow ran up onto the sand, grating against it as it came to rest. The ferrymaster lowered the bow ramp, and Crowley led Cropper ashore. He paused as he came level with the heavy-set man, who was leaning against the railing by the ramp. "The Ranger Egon," he said. "Where would I find him?" The ferrymaster considered the question for a second or two. There was a knowing look about him as he studied Crowley once more. The mention of Egon's name seemed to confirm his earlier supposition that Crowley was a ranger. "Most likely in the tavern," he replied eventually. "That's where he spends most of his time these days, since the unpleasantness with the new man." His tone was even, without any note of censure in it. Crowley nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "How do I reach it?" he asked. He had never visited Seacliff before. The ferrymaster gestured to an opening in the trees some 30 meters down the beach. "That's the track to the top. It winds up to the castle at the top of the hill. The village is 100 meters from the castle, and the tavern is there." Crowley held up a hand in a gesture of thanks, mounted Cropper, and began to walk him toward the track. After a few paces, he turned and called back. "How do I—" he began, but the man anticipated the rest of the question. "Hit that gong on the tree there." He indicated a metal hoop hanging from a tree branch alongside a heavy wooden mallet. "I'll come to fetch you." He moved to the hawser at the stern of the boat, although, in truth, the bow and the stern were interchangeable, and depended on the direction of travel. Seizing the rope, he heaved, and the boat slid smoothly into deeper water, the wavelets battering at the square bow as she slid forward. Crowley watched him go for a second or two, then turned back toward the entrance to the track. He was frowning as he rode into the shade under the trees. So far, the dismissed rangers they had encountered had shown a sense of rebellion and defiance. The news that Egon was likely to be found in the tavern this early in the day was troubling. It indicated that the former ranger had simply given up when he had been replaced. "Don't like the sound of that," he said softly to Cropper. The horse shook its head, rattling his mane and ears as horses tend to do. Apparently, he didn't like the sound of it either. All right, that's going to be the end of chapter number 17. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening. And I'll look forward to seeing you guys next time in chapter 18. God bless, and have a good one.